Good morning. I'm Mitchell Renz, host of the Raiders Report, and I'm sure a lot of y'all woke up this morning just like me. Is there any information on Ben Johnson? Coming up here on today's show, there is some Raiders news to know. And essentially, the way that I figured I would do today's show is this. There was 2 playoff games yesterday. Shout out to the Commanders for getting a big win, and shout out to the Buffalo Bills, man. Please, Buffalo, take care of business up against the Kansas City Chiefs. But I figured maybe there was a lot of things that some people missed. Maybe there's some things that you didn't miss. So essentially what today's show is going to be is there is Raiders head coach news that I think everybody from the nation out there needs to know. And I also think that there's Raiders GM news that every single person out there needs to know. The one thing that you need to know is this. Dan Campbell this morning said that he is prepared to lose Ben Johnson, and he is prepared to lose Aaron Glenn. We'll talk a little bit more of that in detail. Reminder, make sure you click that subscribe button. Make sure you turn on notifications. This week, it's going to be nuts. I'm just telling y'all right now. There was a tweet that I saw last week that it was like, you got to tell your girlfriends, tell your wives, I'm not cheating on you. It's just I'm constantly looking at updates on my phone to see if the Raiders hire Ben Johnson. And if the Raiders do end up hiring Ben, I will be live on this YouTube channel for 7 straight hours. Buckle up. It's going to be a hell of a week here for the Raiders Report, and it's going to be a hell of a week for all Raiders fans out there. So let's first start talking about what Dan Campbell said today. And he said that he was prepared to move on from Ben Johnson, prepared to move on from Aaron Glenn. What he also said, though, was that he was not told yet by Ben or by Aaron that those two are 100% leaving. The reason why that I find that interesting is because I saw there was a rumor late last night during some of the playoff games, and I was like, all right, that's kind of interesting. And there was a rumor going around that apparently Ben Johnson has already told people on that Lions organization and maybe players in the locker room. I don't know what the exact rumor, in terms of who he talked to, but the rumor was that Ben Johnson has already made it known to people inside of that Lions organization that he is going to be leaving. I think the expectation is that Ben Johnson is gone, but the fact that Dan Campbell today at his press conference this morning said that he has not heard whether or not that those two are leaving yet, I do find to be, maybe a little bit interesting. Maybe Dan's, not telling 100% of the truth, but maybe it is the truth. And the bottom line is when people know news is going to happen, and there is going to be a lot of news that happens this week, just make sure that you're watching the right people. Make sure you're getting the right sources. I've already seen, this morning alone, breaking news, the Raiders hired Ben Johnson. It's going to be coming out left and right. Just make sure you guys are staying in tap. I promise you this. If I don't make a video around it, it didn't happen. So if you're like, oh, is this true? Unless I drop a video, it's going to be the 100% way to just guarantee that the news is true. So it was reported, though, that Ben is still thinking about 3 teams, and he's thinking about the Jacksonville Jaguars, the Chicago Bears, and the Las Vegas Raiders. It was also said that he was expected to interview with all 3 of those teams before making a decision. I don't know exactly what's going on with Adam Schefter right now, and I don't know if he's just got a vendetta against the Raiders. Schefter's very, very well tapped in, but Schefter's one thing has always been I don't do opinions, I only report the news, and he's been doing a lot of opinions around the Raiders, and I'll continuously say this. The report that he put out on the Raiders did not trying to trade up for Jaden Daniels, it's not true. I know for a fact that the Raiders did, and you see a lot of other Raiders beat reporters also confirming that the Raiders did try to trade up. I'm not saying that Schefter's going to put out anything wild, but Schefter did also report that he is going to interview or expected to interview with all 3 of those teams because his mind is not met up. And there's a lot of teams out there, there's a lot of reports going on that simply say that Ben Johnson's mind is not made up, and it's not made up. I'm not going to sit up here and say that I think it is made up. Do I think the Raiders are the favorite? Yes. Would I be surprised if the Raiders don't get Ben Johnson? Yeah, I would be surprised. And I think there's a lot of other people outside the NFL that would be surprised as well. So all I'm saying is if Schefter puts something out there, just do a little double checking before just instantly saying it's from Schefter. I'm guilty of it too, and it's something that I got to do. The reason why I'm bringing this up, Diana Rossini from The Athletic, she reported today that it's not a guarantee that Ben Johnson interviews with all 3 of those teams. So the fact that Diana said that this morning, that makes me think that if the Raiders get that first shot to get the interview for Ben, you can't let him walk out the door. In fact, I think whatever team gets that first interview with Johnson, or like if I'm the Raiders, I'm hoping to be either that first interview or I want to be the third interview. I don't want to be the second, and I really want to be the first, because I think if you have the opportunity to hire Johnson, you don't let him leave. And you know what? If you want the Raiders to hire Ben Johnson, if you're in the same boat as me where you're like, if he walks into that room and that's the first job interview, in-person interview, you can't let him leave. I know I've thrown out the term blank check. It was more of just an expression, and it was an old show that I loved as a kid. But I'm telling you this, the Raiders, they're not going to be afraid to offer Ben Johnson some money. The number that I was told last week that we kind of discussed, and I did a show on what I could project Ben Johnson's contract to look like. I'm hearing minimum $15 million per year. And if I had to guess, you're probably going to look at 5 to 6 years. And then 5 times 15, 75, 6 times 15, 90. And the reason why those are the numbers to look at is Andy Reid makes 20, Sean Payton makes 18, Jim Harbaugh is right there around 16. But the Raiders, if they need to, they're not afraid. If they need to make him the highest paid head coach in the NFL, they're going to do it. Mark Davis wants to win, and he doesn't give a shit that he's still paying John Gruden, Josh McDaniels, Antonio Pierce, doesn't care about it. Doesn't care that he's paying 3 GMs on top of that. He wants to win because he knows if they start winning, and it's now, I don't want to say now or never, but when you move a franchise to a brand new city, you do got to get the ball rolling and you got to get them to win. And yes, they're making a lot of money in Vegas, but Mark Davis is not afraid to spend some money. So if you want Ben Johnson, I need to see some BJs down below, and I want this to look like an absolute mess down in the comment section. One of the interesting tweets that I saw late last night, and I'm not going to lie to you, thought about making a video, but Alex, we were doing a lot of, I shouldn't say we, it was Alex and her mom and her sister were over yesterday doing a lot of wedding planning, and they're just doing a lot of stuff, right? A lot of stuff that, let's just say arts and crafts wise, I'm not skilled enough to be able to do. My arts and crafts are literally the way that Luke Getsy likes to call plays after the first drive of a game, right? You don't want Luke Getsy doing anything after that first drive. McDaniels as well. But Vincent Bonsignore said yesterday, I'd be surprised if it wasn't him in regards to Ben Johnson. And Vinny, again, is one of those dudes where that's a tweet, and being somebody that follows the Raiders as much as that I do, that's a tweet where Vinny's putting it out there because he does really truly think that the Raiders are going to end up getting Ben Johnson. And if they don't get Ben, I would say the other name to look at there is Pete Carroll. Why? Actions speak louder than words, and the NFL is all about timelines. And I talked about timelines a lot yesterday, where the Raiders are going to interview 2 GM candidates today. We'll talk about who they are in a moment. The GM candidate they interviewed yesterday, Newmark, we'll talk about him again here in a moment. But timing is everything. The Raiders clearly have a plan. The Raiders also clearly have a plan as well if they do not get Ben Johnson. And if this Ben Johnson situation doesn't happen in Las Vegas, I'm going to make a whole new video. And I kind of already talked about it in a show that I did last week around Raiders head coach GM pairings with OC and DC pairings. And it is still expected that if the Raiders don't get Johnson, they're going to be looking at former Seahawks head coach Pete Carroll, who still worked with Seattle a little bit. I think it was more just so he didn't get mad that he wasn't the head coach anymore. But the other in-person interviews that the Raiders have done, Pete Carroll, Ron Rivera, and then also Robert Saleh. Ron Rivera and Robert Saleh satisfied the Rooney Rule. So again, in order for you to hire a head coach, you need to at least interview 2 minority candidates. Ron Rivera and Robert Saleh satisfy that. But I also think it's, again, I tweeted out yesterday, the Raiders are a team right now that I think is playing chess, and a lot of other teams might be playing checkers from a head coach standpoint. What do I mean by that? I was told about 2 weeks ago, if the Raiders are unable to get Ben Johnson, watch out for them to hire Pete Carroll. But then also, since Pete's 73, I think the right word is predecessor. I think that's the right word, where they would also bring in a predecessor for Pete Carroll on that staff. And I think an interesting name to watch out for there is Robert Saleh. So one of the things that I was just, again, told is they could bring in Pete Carroll, a head coach. You make Robert Saleh the DC, and then when Pete retires, because it could happen any year when you're 73, they could hand the keys to Robert Saleh, and then you just keep the ship moving the way that the ship is moving. I will say the staff that with Ben Johnson and the staff that's not with Ben Johnson, I do think could look really, really different. And if the Raiders don't get Ben, then I don't think that you're going to get a Lance Newmark at GM. You might still bring in John Spytek no matter what. It's a really interesting name to keep in mind. But I'll also say watch out for Ed Dodds. And I know Ed Dodds has yet to get a GM request in terms of him, being this guy for the Raiders, but he's interviewed the last 2 times for the Raiders. Hell, it might have been the last 3 times for the Raiders open GM job. Got a lot of ties with Mark Davis. Got a lot of ties. He worked for the Raiders way, way back in the day in like 2002 with Jim Harbaugh. But Ed Dodds also was a part of that regime. Maybe not, regime's not the right word. Part of the staff that was hired by Jed Hughes back in 2014 when Pete Carroll got a job with the Seattle Seahawks. So there's some ties there. But another name that you got to keep in mind, if Pete Carroll is given the head coach job, and if this predecessor thing is an actual thing that I was told, you got to watch out for Eric Sullivan. And Eric Sullivan was the very, very first GM that the Raiders reached out to in terms of an interview. Why do I say that? I say that because Robert Saleh, very good friends with LaFleur, the head coach of the Green Bay Packers. Mike LaFleur is the offensive coordinator for the Rams right now, but he's not the play caller. I think you could see an interesting situation where if Pete Carroll got hired, I think they would try to bring in LaFleur from the Rams OC. You pair that with Robert Saleh at DC. You have Sullivan, and then Sullivan, who's on that Packers squad. For those that don't know, Robert Saleh and the LaFleur family are very tight. In fact, he was in LaFleur's wedding this past few years, I think is what it was. But he was in that wedding. Like, those guys are that close, and it's why Robert Saleh, when he was fired on the New York Jets, went to the Green Bay Packers and just worked as kind of like a consultant, if you will. Almost the way, Rob Ryan had our job here for the Raiders, which congrats to Rob Ryan getting a job in USC. Now, I know I did a lot of rambling there, and I know there's a lot of information to know, but here's what we do know so far. The Raiders, number one guy they want is Ben Johnson. If they don't get Ben Johnson, watch out for Pete Carroll. And I knew I kind of threw a lot of information out there, a lot of what-ifs, and there are a lot of what-ifs right now. But I just want you to hear this type of stuff because there was a lot of Raider fans yesterday that were like, wow, Lance Newmark came out of nowhere. And then I saw a lot of people on social media and like, no, it wasn't like that was a name that people were talking about a lot. And that's why I'm saying Lance Newmark, for the OG watchers here on the Raiders Report, that was a name that you heard multiple times, so you probably weren't as surprised. So all I want to do now is say Ben Johnson's 1, Pete Carroll's number 2, and the Raiders have already interviewed Pete Carroll, Ron Rivera, Robert Saleh in person. The only head coach candidate that they cannot interview in person if, they are unable to get Ben Johnson for whatever reason, the only guy they can't interview in person is Steve Spagnuolo, the defensive coordinator for the Kansas City Chiefs, because the Chiefs are still playing in the playoffs. Now, if they wanted to interview Todd Monken, Vance Joseph, Aaron Glenn, Ben Johnson, like those guys they can interview now in person. If you miss out on Ben, and I know Pete Carroll's that other name, and I think it's because of the plan that they have in ready to go in case they don't get Ben, I would be really interested in Todd Monken. What Monken did for Georgia for 3 years, especially even with a guy like Brock Bowers, but what he's been able to do the last 2 years in Baltimore, and I know it's a shame that Ravens game kind of ended the way that it did. I feel bad for Mark Andrews, kind of feel bad for Lamar Jackson playing in those conditions. It's tough, but sometimes that's playoff football, and I bet you if you ask Buffalo and Baltimore what type of playoff game they want to get into, it's exactly that type of game. Cold, ground and pound, who's the tougher team? That's what you're going to see. But if you can't get Ben Johnson, I'm not going to lie to y'all, I would be very intrigued by a guy like Todd Monken. Coming up next year, though, we're going to get into the Raiders GM news that I think everybody out there from the nation needs to know. Before we get into it, I got to give a shout out to our sponsor here, Prize Picks, America's #1 daily fantasy sports app out there. You pick more, you pick less on at least 2 players for a shot to win 1,000 times your cash. Run your game all season long on Prize Picks. The big game. It's almost here, and as long as the Chiefs aren't the team to win it, I'm going to be a happy camper. But the big game is almost here, and it's now or never. Don't miss out on the last football game of the season with Prize Picks, the best place to win cash while watching the big game. Prize Picks is also giving away a free pick for the big game, where one of the starting quarterbacks will only need to throw 1 yard to win. If you're correct on at least one more stat projection, you can win real cash. So, for example, if you wanted to, ride with Prize Picks tonight, which Jugs and I were going to be live for the Natty, Notre Dame, Ohio State, Will Howard right now, the quarterback for Ohio State, you could put a Prize Picks lineup in, more or less, and Howard is at 0.5 passing yards. He's going to throw more than 1 passing yard. Like, it's going to happen, right? And there's going to be one person out there like, oh, well, what if he gets hurt? Well, if he gets hurt in the first half, It's all good. They give you your money back. So Will Howard's got one tonight. Find another one. Go put some more or less on a Notre Dame player, because it does have to be a different player if you roll with the Natty tonight, because you can't do 2 Ohio State players. So just something to keep in mind. So check out the promos tab to tail any of the Super Bowl Suite Millie winners. Big game lineups. If you tail a lineup that goes 3 for 3, you can win a split of $1 million in promo funds. If you've been watching the show for a while and you're like, I've always thought about doing prize picks, I think right now is the time to do it. So download the app today. Use code CLNS to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Sign up today and get $50 instantly when you play $5. You don't even need to win to receive the $50 bonus. It's guaranteed. Prize Picks. Run your game. Again, all those links, everything I just mentioned, down in the comments, down in the description of today's show. All right, let's get into the Raiders GM news. I know this video is going a little bit long, but there's a lot of stuff that you need to know. So they interviewed Lance Newmark yesterday, and that was a candidate that's got some ties to Ben Johnson. And I had a lot of people hit me up yesterday. They're like, Mitch, you seem kind of excited about Newmark. And he was with the Lions organization for 26 years. I had, multiple people are like, if there was one team that was worse than the Raiders over the last 26 years, it's the Lions. Why would we want to bring him in? Well, the reason why you'd want to bring him in is because Jed Hughes thinks philosophy, it's smart to be a part of an organization for a long time. Because I think it's smart because you can see the good and the bad. And when you think about when Lance Newmark started to make some actual decisions, right? Like when you start working on a staff early on, you're not making actual decisions. When Newmark started to make actual decisions was really only in the last 3 to 4 years. Let's be honest. The Lions in the last 3 to 4 years have looked like a totally different team. So the reason why I like Newmark is because, yes, he was a part of an organization for a very long time and an organization that lost a lot. And as soon as he was put into power and was actually able to make some real decisions, the Lions started winning. I am a big believer, whether you're talking football, whether you're talking life, whether you're talking a business. If you can take somebody that's been able to do exactly what you're trying to do, that's at least worth an interview. And in worst case, not even worst case, you hire that guy, you expect him to do what he's already been able to do. I do think it's important to note, though, okay? The Raiders wanted Newmark. They could. If they wanted to hire Newmark, they could do it like after Monday. So again, the Raiders are going to interview Chad Alexander, and the Raiders are going to interview Brandon Brown. So Brandon Brown, assistant GM of the Giants, Chad Alexander, assistant GM of the Chargers. And just like I mentioned the Rooney Rule for head coaches, it's the exact same thing for GM. So once the Raiders interview Brandon Brown today and Chad Alexander in person, and both of those guys will interview in person today, the Raiders then, hypothetically speaking, can interview Newmark if they want. Hiring a GM is not the same as a head coach. The Raiders couldn't hire Ben Johnson if they were still playing in the playoffs. If the Raiders wanted to hire Lance Newmark and the Commanders are still in the playoffs, they are allowed to do it. It's a different rule. I don't know why the NFL does it, but it's true. Just like Mike Borgonzi just accepted the GM job for the Tennessee Titans, and the Chiefs are still in the playoffs. So if the Raiders wanted to, and I have people going like, no, we can't hire Newmark because the Commanders are still playing and we got to go out and get Ben Johnson right now. If they hire Newmark, I think that tells you a lot about what they feel with a guy like Ben Johnson. It's going to happen sooner rather than later. I will also say this, though. A lot of smoke around Newmark. And again, timing is everything. But I do think timing is everything. And I think one of the reasons why John Spytek was one of the very first names requested is because that is still a name that we have to keep in mind. If I was a betting man, I would say the top 2 candidates to be the Raiders' next GM, John Spytek, Lance Newmark, but that is based on them linking up with Ben Johnson. If it's not Ben Johnson, it's going to be a little bit interesting. And then, we go right back to the drawing board, and we'll see what it is. I do really think, though, the Raiders have a head coach by the end of the week. I did get an interesting text yesterday that said, Tuesday's going to be crazy. But I don't know if that was just Tuesday's going to be crazy because Tuesday's always my live day, or if because Tuesday's actually going to be crazy. I did message one of the diehard Raiders Report watchers. You know who you are. I gave you some interesting tips. Don't share all that stuff out there, but it's going to be an interesting week, man, no doubt about it. So the other GM candidates are still John Eric Sullivan. Again, that was the guy that I mentioned. Got Green Bay ties. Watch out for Carroll. Watch out for Robert Saleh. Could be an interesting mix. And then also, LaFleur kind of tied into all of that. Sheldon White is the other GM candidate that the Raiders have. He's from the Pittsburgh Steelers, which another very well-run organization. They haven't had a losing season in 18 years, so why not talk to him? And then the only other name that I'm curious about is Ray Agnew. He's the assistant GM for the Detroit Lions. But if Ben Johnson wants Lance Newmark, I think that's who the Raiders are going to end up going with. But I don't think that John Spytek should be a name that we all sleep on. All right, before I get out of here again, Chugs and I are going to be live tonight for the Natty. We're going to go live actually an hour before kickoff, just simply because I wanted to do a mailbag. I know there's a lot of questions, so we're going to answer a lot of Raiders questions, and we're going to do that for the first 30 minutes of that hour before we go live. And then the last 30 minutes, we're going to transition to just talking about Notre Dame, Ohio State. It's going to be a lot of fun. Hopefully you guys pull up. Hopefully you guys are ready to have some fun. At the end of the day, if I'm going to watch this game at home, I might as well watch it with the nation and might as well be able to share our experiences and thoughts, especially if any more Raiders news happens on Monday, because I'm not going to lie, I'm going to be sitting there watching the Natty, right? Like, I'd be on my couch, I'd be sitting there, and then constantly, though, I'd be like, is there any Raiders news? Is there any Raiders news? Well, if any Raiders news happens while we're watching the Natty, we'll talk about it. And if it's really big news, I'm sorry, I'm going to deviate from my Natty coverage, and I'm going to talk about the Raiders, because this is the Raiders Report. All right, so sometimes when I was a kid growing up, I'm not going to lie to you, I didn't read a lot of books. I've found that books have a lot of words, and words and I, kind of go together like oil and water. So if you watch today's show and you're like, man, a lot of information thrown at me, what are the biggest takeaways from this video? Here are the biggest takeaways from this show. The Raiders have satisfied both the Rooney Rule at GM and head coach after today. The reason why you're not going to get a Ben Johnson hiring today or late tonight is because he's not there in person yet. They're going to wait to interview him in person, which is when he's going to make a decision. But the fact that the Raiders have satisfied the Rooney Rule at head coach and GM means after today, they can hire him. So get ready. Noties better be turned on. Ben Johnson is expected to at least consider the Raiders, the Bears, and the Jags. Though, again, I'm somebody that just tries to follow as much rumors as I can. I think it's Raiders and Bears, and then the Jags are just that other team that's thrown in there right now. I don't think the Jags are actually going to happen. The Raiders are the favorites still to land Ben Johnson. If the Raiders don't land Ben Johnson, watch out for the name Pete Carroll to be circulated around there, though I'm going to try to push for Todd Monken if it's not BJ. And then Lance Newmark and John Spytek are the front runners for the GM job if Ben Johnson gets it. A lot of information thrown at you. Make sure you guys are staying intact. If anything happens throughout the day, I promise you, I will keep you up to date. For more news, for more information, you can always hit me up on IG and Twitter at Mitchell Renz 365. But if you're looking for that Raiders content around head coach, GM, all off season long, I got you covered here on the Raiders Report, your one-stop shop for everything around the silver and black. If you want even more content here from the Raiders, I got you. Click this button right here. It's right above my Raiders logo. If you want some videos that YouTube thinks that you would enjoy, you can click on this button right here. And then if you're looking for even more content, if you got that sweet craving, that sweet tooth, and that didn't satisfy it, I promise you this video here is also going to be a pretty dope one.